immediately says, it's a forgery. Well, I've been over and over this question with myself and with lots of colleagues, and it seems quite clear this can't be a forgery. I have one colleague who says, oh yes, this is a very early document, but this is another Umar ibn al-Khattab. Well, there's no other Umar known, but anyway, skepticism is always, something present. But it's a very interesting document. As I said, it has, first of all, it has a lot of names besides that of Omar. Most of them are not very well known. There's a woman named Temlik something, and she seems to be an important personage in the business of this letter, which looks to me like it's a distribution of a small amount of money. Probably someone died and left a certain amount of money is being distributed. 1 dinar here, 1 dinar there. Omar gets 1 dinar. There's a woman who gets 2 dinars. And then there's these other names that are listed, and many of them are unidentified.
Mostly women.
Beg pardon?
They're mostly women. The names you have.
We'll get to that in a minute. What's interesting is if you look at the list of names, there's some that stand out. Kulthum, Asma, Aban, these are all names of companions, women, companions of the Prophet in the close circle of the Prophet. The Prophet's never mentioned. Islam is never mentioned. The Quran is never mentioned. But there's this striking collection of names of people who are known from the literary sources as having been companions of the Prophet Muhammad. So this looks like something that was written to people in Medina at the time of the Prophet's life. But it doesn't tell us anything about Muhammad or about Islam, actually. And so very interesting, as I say, was the fact that this has, even though this is probably the oldest Arabic letter that we have, it shows well-developed standard epistolographic format in Arabic. It's exactly the format you would see in letters of the 9th and the 10th century and right up until recent times. It starts with Bismillah. It gives the names of the sender and the addressees. It has polite formula. I wish God's favor on you, blah, blah, blah. And then Amma Ba'du, now then. And then you get into the business of the letter. And at the end, it says, Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So it's just exactly like all the letters in Arabic that we see for centuries. This means that this epistolographic format must have been something that was current probably for a long time before this letter was written. It was already a tradition to do it this way, which means that we have to assume that the writing of letters like this one must go back at least 100 years, say, before the 7th century. We just don't happen to have any surviving examples of it. Also very interesting is the fact that this letter includes standard monotheistic formulae, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, at the end, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, but it's distinctively monotheistic, but it's not definitively Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. There's nothing in this, doesn't mention Jesus, there's no cross, there's no mention of Moses or nothing that would identify. This is a monotheist. That's all we can say about this person. So the question is, does this reflect some kind of pre-Islamic monotheism that reigned in presumably in Medina, where this letter must have been written to? Does it reflect something at the bottom of the screen is keeping us from seeing the last line at the bottom? Doesn't matter. I'm just going to raise the possibility that this is a letter that reflects what we know of from the Quran and from also the traditional biography of the Prophet, the Sirah, that talks about the so-called Hanafiya movement, the pre-Islamic monotheists of Arabia. The Quran itself enjoins the believers, oh, you who believe, be like Abraham. He was a Hanif Muslim. He was a Hanif, which must mean some kind of monotheist. As I worked on this, I began to remember that 30 some years ago, I had edited a bunch of early inscriptions, the photographs of which I had been given by a colleague at the University of Chicago. It's an art historian. He had traveled in Saudi Arabia with his father, who was an engineer working in Jeddah. And they went for lunch one day outside of Medina, stopped for a picnic, and he wandered off to look at a rock face, and he saw these inscriptions. So he took photographs, and then he brought them to me, and I looked at them. I said, well, these look like they're very early. So he said, okay, if you want to publish them, go ahead. So I did. And one of them, well, where am I going here? going backwards on my list. Here's one of them, the transcription or the copy of what it looks like on the wall. And you can see the script, again, is very early. Notice the open ayn and the open meme, the big memes, very strikingly clear. And if you look at it, it says, what's it say? Amantu annahu la ilaha illa alladhi amanat bihi banu Israel hanifan musliman wa ma ana min al-mushrikeen. وكتب الرافع ابن علي or Khalid, or we don't know exactly what the final name is. What's interesting is he says, Amantu, I bear witness to, or I believe in that which the children of Israel believed in, Hanif and Muslim. He says, I am a Hanif, a believing Hanif and Muslim. I'm not one of the associators, the mushrikeen. So when I published these 30 years ago, I thought, well, these are early Islamic inscriptions and these are quotes from the Quran. They're very similar to passages in the Quran. It occurs to me now that they might actually be Hanifite inscriptions, and that the Quranic verses actually are mimicking this kind, that this actually precedes the Quran in a way, just rather than this quoting the Quran. So this might actually be from, say, 600. We don't know, there's no date. Anyway, these are some of the things I've been fooling with, so I hope you found it enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fred. This was, for those of us who are not experts, this was extremely enlightening, at least for me. Okay, my pleasure now to introduce Lenna. I've already introduced her, but please, Khalidi, just move the microphone as close as I can.
All right.
This one also.
Hopefully my voice carries.
I hope.
I tend to do that. So this is going to be a very different kind of presentation and different time frame, because I am talking about modern Palestinian history. And when he asked me to do this paper, he said, this is happening in Jerusalem, and we want people to talk about their current research, but some people are going to be talking about Jerusalem. And I don't work in Jerusalem, but I do work on the Palestinian city. So I wanted to kind of try to think about how writing urban Palestinian history can help us change the way that we think about Palestinian society, kind of rewrite misconceptions. And in this, my work kind of follows a trend in Palestinian historiography that has been basically pushing the focus on writing Palestinians into their own history, as Ibrahim Abu-Lughod told us, and this is one of my early inspirations. Rashid met me as this was, I was embarking on that. But the newer literature has trying very much to focus on the Palestinians' experience and strategy, rather than merely treating them as subjects of colonial regimes and state control mechanisms. Social and urban histories have played a very significant part in deepening this trend and in deepening our understanding of the socioeconomic, cultural, and political dynamics within the Palestinian society. But one of the biggest gaps that remain within this trend is the Palestinians who became citizens of Israel after the Nakba, who continue to be largely ignored. So even as Palestinians are inscripted into their own history, these Palestinians tend to be outside of that spectrum. And what I try to do in my work, and I'm going to try to kind of give a little bit of snippets of that in this talk, is to continue this trend of exploring the changes in the socioeconomic and political urban dynamics that shaped the Palestinian society across 1948. So in exploring Nazar's history of survival and struggle, I bridged this historiographic narrative of 1948 as a moment of complete rupture, which very much predominate the study of the region. I kind of always say, every history tends to have this kind of continuation, except the Palestinian history. It has a start date or an end date. It starts or ends in 48. And there's a schism between them, which I try to challenge. So I use Nazareth as a case study to show how the how urban history can help us challenge not only this historiographic misconception, but other historiographic misconceptions about Palestinian history, which is often told through dichotomies and essentializations. For instance, this literature tends to homogenize the Palestinian elite and present them as a kind of a strata strictly separated from the masses. And then another tendency is to categorize people as heroes or traitors. And my work challenges these by telling a much more multi-layered story of resistance, collaboration, and staying in the city. So rather than a flattened Palestinian who appears to be a passive victim of the British and later the Israeli rule, the Palestinians in the story that I tell through the story of the city have different political approaches and act in diverse ways that change over time. And as Rashid mentioned, this is kind of a long-term project that has been looking at Nazareth and the transition between the Mandate and Israel that started with my dissertation that attempts to tell the story of Palestinians as they lived through the Nakba, a time of rupture, transformation, oppression, but also ultimately survival. And the city of Nazareth, in this sense, stands out in the Palestinian history because it is the only Palestinian cities that survived inside Israel after the Nakba. And ironically, through the destruction of the Palestinian urban texture, Nazareth becomes the only city for the Palestinians who remain and their social, political, cultural, and economic center. Unlike other Palestinian urban centers, Haifa, Yafa, Ramli, and Akka, for instance, which were radically decimated, Nazareth actually grew significantly after the Nakba because of the influx of refugees to the city from the other Palestinian cities and the nearby towns and villages. But this wasn't the only thing that Nazareth experienced. Nazareth was a trade center before 1948 and a British administrative center, and of course, as we all know, a significant Christian city and a center of pilgrimage. And the only thing that survived after 1948 of this is actually the city retaining its special Christian center, which actually gains a lot of attention after 1948. As a result of the devastation of the Palestinian urban space and much of the surrounding rural community, the centrality of Nazareth was now coupled with isolation. Nazareth residents had to find their place in a radically transformed landscape in which new Jewish rural settlements were basically proliferating at the expense of the Palestinian ones. And what I do is I trace municipal politics, labor mobilization, and water management as sites of the political and the mundane in Nazareth. And through that, I try to explore these questions that I mentioned before. For example, rethinking what elites and what leadership mean in the Palestinian context. So I join recent literature that kind of tries to complicate our understanding of the elite, but also reject their exclusivity in leading the Palestinians and inserting other groups that were active in shaping Palestinian politics, including youth, women, middle class, and what Shireen Said-Khalid calls men of capital, and working class, and other political parties. And Nazareth, in that sense, presents an especially intriguing case in retelling Palestinian political and social history. Very few members of the Palestinian urban elite remained in what became Israel after 48, after the Nakba. But in Nazareth, the landed moneyed class, most of its wealthy notables, and the religious leadership remained overwhelmingly. They maintained some of their authority and continued to claim to speak for the city and for the Palestinians more generally. Of course, their power did not go unchallenged. So in coping with the new state policies, they were also true contest over the leadership of the city as various social and political groups challenged this elite and tried to insert themselves, in addition to the fact that the state of Israel was trying to fully force them under its control. And the changes here, the challenge to the elites was not a new thing. I want to highlight, and this is one of the things that I constantly try to repeat, to remind us in my work. This is also a continuation of a development that begins in the 1940s, in which new groups start vying to represent the Palestinians, and not necessarily with full success, as the elite maintains, or the Arab Higher Committee and such groups continue to speak for the Palestinians, but they're definitely being challenged and pushed. And in Nazareth, a very influential contender was the Palestinian communists. They had been mobilizing since the 1940s through political parties in the mandate, through the National Liberation League, and afterwards through Maki, the Israeli Communist Party. But they also had labor unions and women's and youth organizations, and they play an instrumental role in interactions with the state in Nazareth, both during the mandate of Israel, but in a more significant way after the Nakba, as they found themselves in the midst of unprecedented transformation from a small marginalized group, albeit very active and vocal during the mandate. They became prominent political force in Israel during its early years, with the exodus of the majority of the Palestinian national leadership and its political class. As I mentioned, they're not new. They're very grounded in the city, which gives them the ability to basically spring into action during the Nakba already. When Nazareth is occupied in July 1948, they're actually very instrumental in trying to prevent the departure of the Palestinians from the city, which of course they had the help of the fact that they've seen the experience at this point. There's some statistics that talk about 20,000 refugees in a city of 15,000. The people in Nazareth had already seen what happens to those who leave, and I argue that was a part of it. But the communists go around trying to convince people to stay put, and they even put a blockade on in Nazareth's Khanoup, in the main entrance of the city, to kind of send people back and say, "What are you doing? No good reason to leave." And very, very soon after, they actually tried to grasp a new space in leading the city. They meet with the Israeli leadership that comes to the city and kind of try to already start advancing a narrative of how the state should treat the Palestinians, and in part, they do that through demanding Israel stand to its promises in the Declaration of Independence, of promising Palestinians rights within the state. So in this process, they also start kind of reshape the ways Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian rights are being presented, building on their different ideologies. So in a discourse that continues their discourse during the mandate, they insist that the contest is not between Arab and Jews, but one that kind of centers working class solidarity in the fight for national rights against oppression, while also claiming that the elites were either collaborators or simply lackeys of the Israeli authorities, and that they are truly the representatives of the national interest. And that, in fact, the elites were colluding with the Israeli authorities in order to prevent Palestinians from gaining their rights. And this history, in somewhat ironic ways, now comes into this flip side of it, where it becomes deeply contested among the Palestinians. in a narrative that is very embroiled in either claiming their heroism or treason. And what I try to do is get away from that in both cases of the elites, of the traditional, let's call them quote unquote traditional elites, the wealthy, the religious leadership, but also the communists, by actually trying to historicize these groups and try to understand their experience. I provide, and here where urban history is really a useful tool, is that it allows us to provide a dense local scene for challenging the prevalent narrative and this dichotomy. And in trying to do this and seeking to undermine this and trying to explain it, I kind of try to see what are these people doing in undermining or challenging their repression and dispossession at that point. I try to show how that the Palestinians basically respond in different places, which a part of me wants to say, obviously, but unfortunately, if you look at the historiography, there's this totalizing tendency. You speak about one thing, one response, one thing that is right, at least, with a clear vision. And what I say is, at that moment, what the right response is far from clear. Because at that moment, for the Palestinians who are still facing the specter of continues, and up until very recently, people talked about 59 as kind of the end year of the expulsion, but now new research is showing that it actually continues far beyond that in the Nakba, specifically in the south. So as Palestinians are facing this specter of expulsion, al-baqa, remaining at home, becomes paramount national interest. And through that, basically, what I try to say is, can reframe, re-engage the national interest through thinking about this present. And this urban history, through this, actually shows us how, for this group, there's a reformulation and a renegotiation of what it means to work for the collective good, for the best of the city. With the Palestinians under strict control, cut off from Palestinians and Arabs from the rest of the world, but also segmented internally by the state through confessional and local belongings, but also through strict controls of the military government, who had to negotiate this new reality and try to figure out what to do. And in this process, compromise and accommodation with Israeli officials, with the baqa as its goal, with the remaining at home as its goals, basically doesn't become automatically betrayal of the national interest. If we try to think about things more in the way that people themselves were experiencing them. And in a very strange way, in the last paper, I tried to conceptualize this. I started with a sentence from Emir Habibi's Sudasiyat al-Ayam Sitta, where he kind of talks about, he does this mocking thing about, like, they used to say you're traitors for remaining, but now they glorify our poets as the national poets. And there is this call into this to kind of asking us to rethink, to forsake created in this, and really engage this history in more critical ways. Not, of course, excusing or grades, but actually trying to understand and redefine our look at Palestinian history and dynamics and changes away from preconceived notions and essentialized fictions. And we can do that through the city as a site of Palestinian experience, even after 1948, and the perceived end of Palestinian urbanity in the Nakba. And in fact, for me, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking that this is very appropriate to this conversation to think about this Palestinian urbanity right here. The old kind of has been, whose urbanity and urban development have been challenged and kind of pushed to the brink over these years. But as the center and as Rashid reminds us at the beginning, this is not a foregone story, and this is the potential for what we can make of our cities and what we can make of our urbanity lays. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lenna. That was very enlightening. I hand over now to Pierre-Filieu. You have a microphone right in front of you.
It's fine, thank you. I have to admit that each time I came, it was worse than the time before. So there was this silver lining that this time I was coming to the Khalidi library in this whole process of existing under such demanding, depressing condition of siege, occupation, settlement. And I think it's very important to have this meeting today, and I am proud and happy of being part of it. Today, I will just present a very summary work in progress of what could be my next book. I don't know the title yet, but I have a question, and I'm sure that many of us in this room question how the national liberation movement, with such a background, symbolic background, so many financial resources, it was probably the worst liberation movement in recent history, so much back diplomatically, how could such a movement get us to that low? And you were referring to Emil Habibi and his pessimism. Could it get worse? Oh, yes, it could, of course. So what I tried, because I'm in this room among people who are far more sophisticated and who produced books far more elaborate and respected than mine, what I tried is trying to isolate the three Israeli point of view, what were their main, let's say, sorry about the joke, and what were the main weaknesses on the Palestinian side. And my method is always trying to be a bit competitive and not to deliver what is expected. So you prepare not to hear what you might expect. So among the main strengths of Israel, I think first and foremost was that Zionism was Christian before. And it's only today that we grasp the magnitude of the importance. As you know better than me, most of what I will say you very well. I just advocate some kind of interpretation grid that, of course, is like always ready to be better. It's a work in progress. But the very fact that probably half a century before Herzl, prominent thinkers in the Protestant Anglo-Saxon world believed that the fulfillment of the prophecies
went through the return, quote unquote, of the people of Israel to Eid's, quote unquote, land, is critical in understanding the way it goes today. Because when Herzl founded his own Jewish Zionism, as you know, he had to fight significant opposition inside the Jewish world, especially the religious currents, the various currents. Why somebody like Balfour was absolutely convinced that this very process from his own Christian Zionist belief was not only legitimate, but was embedded with very strong religious, even practical mission. Even at this early age, the Christian Zionists, they were not called that way at that time, but we know what they are today, both in the US were critical in pushing the Zionist movement while the Jewish diaspora was, to say the least, divided. And we see, I just mentioned, landmarks over the way because it's all very well known. Truman, when Truman decided to support the partition plan wholeheartedly, it's not because of the Jewish community, it's because of the Deep South. And he's himself through the Missouri Democratic Party machine, very, very open, not to say the least, to what the Deep South says about the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And when AIPAC became AIPAC, it was not through the Jewish community. It was basically by draining, when it became so powerful, by draining resources from all those constituencies where local congressmen had to rely on this kind of vote. And when more recently, Trump did everything he did to destroy what was left of the peace process, it was not to appease the Jewish community that kept on voting for Obama and then Biden 75 to 80%, but it was to address the Bible Belt and this movements, who today are the main unconditional supporters of the settlers. And Netanyahu understood that very early on, because half of his life until the age of 40 was lived in the US, because of his own very problematic relationship with the Jewish diaspora. And in fact, his main focus outside is on those forces that support him unconditionally and that consider that, with all the quotes again, the real Holy Land is now in Judea, in Samaria, is not over there. So I think that's one of the main strengths, been a little bit underestimated before. The second one, and maybe it's a former diplomat talking, I've been always impressed by the fact that the Zionists before and Israel today, they never say what is the end game. They never say. They never say. Which is very smart, because the moment you tie yourself to kind of an end game. At one moment, they accepted a limitation from outside. They accepted that the British mandate would be east of the Jordan, west of the Jordan River, and that created, as you know, the schism of the revisionist movement. Otherwise, they have been always very smart in always accepting what they could get without losing sight of their strategic aim. Okay, I wouldn't mirror it with the Palestinian liberation movement, but you understand that they were far smarter and stronger in that than their counterparts. And each time, each step, each fait accompli, one of the few words remaining in diplomatic English, each fait accompli remained final. No, it's pocketed, it's over. And you see that through creating this, and you know all the percentages, so I don't want to tell you again, I was the first percentage of the first partition plan, I was the percentage of the second partition plan, I was the percentage of the establishment of the state of Israel. But each time they never say it's fine. Each time they never say it's fine. No? And by leaving their option open, they keep the absolute freedom of new fait accompli, whether on the wider level or on the local level, which is why they are so good at micromanagement, which is why they are so good at dragging the attention of the whole world on this small point and making it the big thing that, you know, everything is happening there and a new fait accompli, and then it's over. And then suddenly you realize that, of course, it didn't solve anything, it only made it worse. So Netanyahu dropped that main armor during the so-called deal of the century. That I insist on that, and I know how, you know, you might hear that, but I insisted. We're talking about the struggle between two national movements, between two. The fact that the Zionist movement before and Israel today is democratically vibrant is key to the balance of power, because thanks to this inclusive democratic dynamics, they could deal with their extremists as an additional tool. They could always, they try to include them, so now they include them so much that they are at the top of the government, but it has always been very efficient. Remember, 47, 45, 47, 48. Oh yes, it's not us, it's not Haganah, it's Irgun, it's the extremists, it's Lehi. And like that, always having, you know, the bad guys, but in the room, not outside of the room. Science through, and you know better than me, the electoral system that give a small fringe group a significant power. You know, when you come to a negotiation table and you say, well, I'm ready to, but I have those people in parliament, they represent, this is the voice of the people, I cannot go against them. How could you go against the voice of the people? It's a tremendous argument. And the fact that, of course, the Palestinians could not use it or didn't want to use it or use it exactly in the contrary was very detrimental to their own cause. And as you see today, you know how the dynamics come, how now the settlers that were fringe are now at the very heart of the power is, in my own interpretation grid, quite a proof of what I said, because it's democratic. Of course, we know liberal democracy, exclusive, we know all that. But the very fact that you can include those extremists and use them and portray them as the bad guys has been key, in my view, to the continuous sequence of Zionist victory. So now let's come to the tough part, the Palestinian weaknesses. I have three of them. And they are not all, you know, of Palestinian responsibility, but they are, of course, connected to the Palestinians. The first one is, of course, from my point of view, the pan-Arabic illusion. Because yes, we know Palestine is Arab. Yes, no problem about that. But when you have a national liberation movement, you have to focus on the territory and on a dynamic. And if the so-called supporters or allies or godfathers become detrimental because of their own agenda, because of their rivalries, because of their inner fightings, then what you get from invoking Arabism is far less than what it cost you. It started very early, you know, in Paris, 1913, the poor Palestinian delegates at the Arab Congress were trying to say Zionism, Zionism, and all the other delegates said, shh, the French say you shouldn't speak about Zionism. Okay, so let's yeah, but we have a problem. You know, Khalidi was publishing Zionism, you know, to explain, to try to make it. And the other Arabs say, no, we'll deal with it later. We always will deal with it later. No? You know how much this pan-Arabic illusion was detrimental to the assertion of Arab nationalism. You know how it was the Arab leaders who convinced the Higher Arab Committee to suspend the general strike in 1936, while obviously the general strike was the only way to keep the Palestinian society united in its fight. And then I won't speak about 48. I won't speak about the fact that when you have the UN Geneva Convention, the only thing Arabs agree upon is no Palestinian representation. And then the fact that, of course, there was a Nakba, but that was, of course, as a mirror effect of a Nakba, an Arab consistent denial of Palestinian identity. Of course, we all know about the annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, but the other so-called progressive regime didn't act very differently, because when they had Palestinians, they wanted to have their Palestinians, the Saika with the Baz, the Arab Liberals. So you know all that. So it's only through the second PLO, because the first PLO was a tool of the Arab League and therefore of Nasser regime to really control the Palestinian movement. It's only through the second PLO and through Fatah and Arafat that this Palestinian self-assertion as a Palestinian national movement really came true. But even that, you know, how Arafat got dragged into wars that were lost before they started, against Jordan in 1970, against Syria in Lebanon in 1976, against Syria in Lebanon in 1983. For what? If the issue is Palestine. For what? So we know for what. We know the refugee camp, Haq al-Awda, we know all that. But at the end of the day, the thing that the first Intifada did more for the Palestinian national rights than all those battles between Arabs. And we saw that when finally there was this Arab Peace Initiative, it was only 2002, and it was far too late, because it was in the middle of the second Intifada, where the suicide bombings had already changed the Israeli public opinion. And now, what can I tell you about the Abraham Accords and, you know, Arab states deciding the Palestinian question is obsolete, and being, you know, at the forefront of an international campaign to say it's over, it's done. The second, and of course, sorry, Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, you know, Yarmouk has been besieged, the Palestinian refugee camp, besieged, bombed, starved for 2.5 years. I haven't seen many Palestinian reactions to that, because there was already this illusion, okay, Assad is what is, but is it Talat al-Mukawama, bombing and killing Palestinians, and of course bombing and killing Syrians, but even from the very Palestinian point of view. The second structural weakness is factionalism, and on that I'm pretty weak, but of course you all know that Palestinian liberation movement has been weakened very early on by the factional dynamics, okay, Husseini, Nashashibi, Muaridin versus Majlisin, and so on, Majlisiyin, sorry. And it's only at the moment when this factional dynamic is suspending, like during the general strike in 1936, because after that it started again, that the Palestinians have moved forward with their rights and national goals. So you know that how much it has weakened historically, strategically, the Palestinian leadership and its mobilization. So immediately I add, if factional dynamics are so efficient, it's also because on the other side you have exile, repression, killing, liquidation. So of course, you know, when you are, it's not, they're not living in a vacuum. They're living under the permanent threat of an enemy that is permanently threatening to dispose of them. But certainly this factional dynamics is something that is like a red thread of the whole Palestinian history, even through the PLO, where with all the factions, that were, and we can go back to the Pan-Arab illusion, because many of them were only the arms of this or that regime, and that have been deeply disturbing and weakening for the general national liberation, because yes, okay, we are all Palestinian, but we are Palestinian we are Palestinian relating. We have an entry gate to the Palestinian. This is this movement, this faction, this. So Yasser Arafat managed more or less to contain this factionalism, but only through a very authoritarian rule, or let's say arbitrary rule. He controls them because he didn't want. He didn't want to share his power, and the problem is that he transferred this way of managing into the Palestinian Authority. But when I wrote the history of Gaza, I was fascinated to see that it's in a matter of days. The Intifada starts in December 1987, and a few days later, Hamas is founded by a personal decision of Sheikh Yassin against the whole leadership of the Muslim Brothers. But that means that in a few days, you have a movement that eventually will force PLO into the so-called peace process, but into the so-called two-state solution. And immediately you have a faction that emerged and saying, no, we want the liberation of all Palestine, which was the basic mission assigned to the PLO in the very beginning, but under Islamic terms. So the moment this movement moved, another one occupied the vacuum, and therefore, because okay, now everybody is idealizing the first Intifada compared to the second, but you know that during the first Intifada, many Palestinians were killed by fellow Palestinians because of that. You are betraying, and so on and so forth. So, and today, of course, the division between the West Bank and Gaza, you know it better than me. And the third one is, of course, the double standard. So for this,
is what?
Double standard. The exceptional status of Israel allow it to go on for decades with war crimes that are supposed to be banned under the international law. So you know that, you know the way that everybody who dares to stand against that could be branded anti-Semitic, to say the least, and that in fact you have this double standard that has been really weighing on the whole international relations system, and which is also why I use it as my third and last entry point in this presentation, and eventually in the coming book, because it proves that Palestine is not only so central, for obvious reasons. It's at the center of the Middle East, that is at the center of the world, but it's also because Palestine, the Palestinian question, quote unquote, this is how it is officially, or Palestine question, sorry, officially named by the UN, has produced the largest number of diplomatic literature at the UN. You know, there's nothing compared. You know, the Palestinian, you put it, it's incredible. Between the resolutions, the reports, the commissions, the various entities that have been founded, and that for the situation we know, which is at best, you know, freezing the encroachment during a limited period of time. So if today people now waking up saying, oh, Ukraine, all this, lament about the fact, oh, the Russian veto at the Security Council. Oh, the Russian veto at the Security. Oh, very bad Russian veto at the Security. It's very bad. But you know, before there were the other vetoes at the Security Council. And before the Russian vetoed about Ukraine, they vetoed about Syria. And in fact, they used, and you can make a parallel between what they did in Syria and what the Americans did with Israel. And of course, you had the so-called global war on terrors. And in my view, there was the George W. and then there was the Putin one supporting Assad, who are blurring, you know, objective issues that are dealt with international law in order to dramatize a big tragedy of good versus evil, us versus terrorists, and so on and so forth. So certainly the persisting injustice prevailing in this territory was key to bringing down the UN system. Yeah? But because I have, you know, because I'm not a pessimist, I'm an optimist at the end of the day. I do believe, and having been recently for months teaching in Ukraine, that what is happening now in Ukraine, the fact that at the end of the day, the best weapons are the weapons of international law, no matter what you achieve on the ground. And on that, Palestinians have very, 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 very good arguments. They missed the previous train. Why? Because the previous train was Kuwait. And in Kuwait, they were with the bad guys. You know, instead of supporting a country that was occupied and annexed, they stood with a barbarian who had decided to do that, saying, "Oh, he's a new Salahuddin." I remember at that time. That was one of the time I had my biggest tension with my Palestinian friends. And at the end of the day, we'll never know. But because Pierre-Filieu was sidetrapped by this Arafat aligning against Abu Iyad advice, one could have imagined a peace process with the PLO if PLO would have stood with international law instead of dropping it. So my only advice is stand with Ukraine. Stand with Ukraine. It can only bring you good. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. I'm gonna pose a couple of questions, a question at least to each of the presenters, a brief question, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience. However, I warn you, we only have until 12:45. So I am opening the floor not to speeches, not to statements of position, but to brief questions to our three presenters. I want to ask Fred a very brief question. How do these discoveries in papyrus that you, at least the three things that you showed us, relate to what I think was your revolutionary conclusions in Muhammad and the Believers, the book that I think showed how monotheism and Islam are, I don't want to summarize your book, but the relationship between early pre-Islamic monotheism and Islam has been ignored by many scholars. Don't answer it now. I'm going to ask questions to each of the three, and then I'll let each of you answer in turn, and then I'll open the floor to questions. Nina, I want to ask you a question, which is, I think what you've done, what you've tried to do and what you've done is to historicize a history which has been politically contested by many writers from different sides of the political aisle in Palestine, inside Lebanon, especially, but also outside. And as you said, there are no traitors and no heroes. Unfortunately, there are some people who still persist in this traitors and heroes. And can you say a little bit about that? And Jean-Pierre, I mean, because you're now talking about areas that I've written about, thought about.
Of course.
So I could ask you 11 or 18 or 27 questions. I have to say, I very much like, especially your idea that Zionism was Christian before it was Jewish. I mean, the first public major Zionist is not Jewish. He's Lord Shaftesbury. And for 50 years, you're absolutely right. And you're right up to the present. But I don't want to ask you about that. When you said Israel is a vibrant polity and democracy, of course, you mean only for Jews.
Yes.
Obviously, I think you may have said that. But I want to ask you a brief question about the issue of the pan-Arab illusion. And you talk about Arafat and the PLO getting into battles that they didn't need to get into. And I mean, I understand why you say that, but I mean, I was in Beirut during much of the time of some of those battles, and I was in Amman previously, and I think that you're right up to a point. I think that in Amman, the PLO was dragged into a battle that it shouldn't have fought and couldn't have won. But I think you're underplaying the degree to which behind all of this was Kissinger. And the war with the Syrians, especially the 76 war, was a war which was planned and organized. We have now the documents, the American documents, by the United States. The United States sicked the Syrians on the PLO by promising Hafez al-Assad things which, in return for which he was supposed to crack down on the PLO. How the PLO and Kamal Jumblat could have avoided that, having been there, I can tell you, I really don't know. So I agree with you. These are battles that took the PLO away from Palestine. Obviously, you're right about that generally. But I think in some of the specifics, I think you should have, you said it at the beginning. Sometimes they were forced to, but I'd ask you to say something about it. So please, Fred, perhaps a brief response, Nina, a brief response, Jean-Pierre, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Fred.
So how did these documents relate to the vision of Islam beginning as a kind of monotheistic reform movement that was open to other kinds of monotheists besides what we call today Muslims? I think actually the documentation supports that. That's one of the things I like about it. It tends, for example, this letter, which is monotheistic, but it's not, shall we say, confessional, as we would, it doesn't show itself to be Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. It's monotheistic. I think there's much more evidence for a very strong monotheistic background to the origins of Islam. I think the more evidence we find from the 7th century and the 6th century, and tons of it is coming out now, I think that will simply become incontrovertible in time. 2 days ago, I received a manuscript from, some of you may know him, Christian Julien Robin, Paris, probably the greatest scholar of South Arabian antiquities today, certainly one of the greatest. And
you found it in Saudi Arabia.
Beg pardon?
You found it in Saudi Arabia.
He has just sent this manuscript to me, which is 400 pages about the history of the Christian community in Najran, which is, and he has, there's one photograph where he shows a valley north of Najran, 100 kilometers from Najran, with rock walls. And he says, a view of this valley, he says, on the rock walls, there are hundreds of thousands of inscriptions. Almost none of these have been brought into the historical record yet. So we're on the threshold of a revolution in our understanding of Arabian society. And what he has found so far shows very clearly that South Arabia, the kingdoms in South Arabia, Yemen, and so on, were from the 4th century on, it was entirely monotheistic. So anyway, I think the documentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, well,
I thought so. Just a second.
Thank you, Rashid, for this question. I mean, the simple answer is that people are very entrenched in rivalries. But the more elaborate answer is that these rivalries also impact current political structures and current political competitions, which makes people extremely invested in maintaining these boundaries. So the fact that I actually write things that say, well, you can't really call people traitors or heroes makes me on the one side necessarily, because there's only one explanation to why you can historicize this history. And this is kind of, I think, the battle that we need to do, because even some of those moments that you were talking about, and Nazareth Elite actually were Nashashibi affiliated, the wealthy elite.
The
Fahoums and those. But it's the amazing thing is it's so hard to let go. I was giving a lecture to these youth leaders last week, and they kept trying to find a treason explanation to why Nazareth or other places survived. And you kept saying, but they were feudal landlords. And I'm like, feudal is not a correct analysis for Palestine in 1948. And he just couldn't give it up. So I think this is one of the things I was trying to get at, is that we need to do a revisiting of what Palestinian nationalism means, that it doesn't necessitate within it this need to also mark as an internal enemy. We have enough enemies outside that we don't actually need the internal ones.
Thank you very much. Jean-Pierre.
Thank you, Rashid. Of course, you know this intimately firsthand. This is the very concept of Tawrit, the way minority factions dragged the PLO into wars that the PLO could not win. It was the PFLP clearly in Black Jordan, number 1917 Jordan, and it was Kamal Jumblat and the national movement in Lebanon, because they were far weaker than when without the PLO fighting force. They could not have dreamt to achieve victory. And from April 1975 to January 1976, Arafat is very keen not getting involved. It's the attack on Karantina that drags him into the war. So you're absolutely right. And also about the Kissinger dimension, I just wanted to try and highlight a pattern where, because no national movement has infinite resources. So either you decide that this battle is the battle of destiny or not. And that it's very obvious to me, but of course the expertise in this room overwhelms my individual limited knowledge, that until the end of the 80s, not enough resources were allocated to Dakhel compared to Kharij, because you had all this Arab, and Arafat was obsessed by that, the way. And of course, when Assad want to take the PLO from him, of course he has to fight. He has absolutely no choice, and to go back to Tripoli and so on and so forth. But in the meantime, well, Sheikh Yassin was working pretty well, developing his networks and all the things you know perfectly. And they were attacking Haidar Abdel-Shafi in Gaza. They were advancing their own goals, while the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people was busy elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'd be happy to take questions. We have about 15 minutes. Please just identify yourself if you have a question. Tfaddal. Anybody? Other members of the International Advisory Board? Tfaddal.
Maybe I have a question to you.
أستاذنا عارف حالك معلش.
أنا اسمي وليد سالم. أنا بدرس في جامعة القدس. I'm teaching at Al-Quds University.
It's okay.
I'm teaching in MA master program about Jerusalem studies. So I'm teaching students of MA on Jerusalem studies. Anyway, my questions to you is the following. You talked about Israel as a vibrant democracy. which is, I see your point. It is a big strength among the international community. But at the same time, what about other descriptions of the Israeli democracy, such as I will mention some, Michael Mann, settler democracy, considered to be in his book, The Dark Side of Democracy, he considered to be settler democracy. Or Vandenberg, he talked about Herrenvolk democracy. Or the Norwegian Nils Potensen spoke about ethnocracy instead of democracy. And even if you go to Israelis, some Israelis, open ethnocracy or and ethnic democracy, Sami Smucha. So how comes that we will say we will choose one side by saying it is a vibrant democracy and that's all?
Shukran. Why don't we take all of the questions and then each of you answer any questions directed to you? Any other questions? سليم. معليش عارف عن حالك الكل بيعرفك بس معليش.
I want to ask Fred Donner.
Fred, question for you.
Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I was wondering if your suggestions about early theistic, non-Jewish, non-Christian, non-Muslim feeds into somehow rejuvenating or supporting the thesis about Hagerism.
What is it?
Hagerism.
Well, yes and no.
Why don't we, we collect questions and you will all answer in turn at the end. Otherwise we'll never finish. غادة, تفضل.
غادة مفتوح جامعة بلزيت. I have two questions, or one comment and a question. The discussion about the Zionist idea being a Christian Zionist to start with, and there are some writings that I think we're all familiar with about that. I was just not sure where are you taking this argument? Like, what do you want to emphasize by saying that Zionism started as the Christian Zionist to start with, like in Christianity more than it's a Jewish call. So that's my first question. My second question, I think you rushed quickly at the end when talking about the Palestinian, problems of the national movement. And when you talked about the new project or the different project of resistance of Hamas after the first Intifada, a few days after the first Intifada, but we know that there was something cooking before that, actually, before 1987 with the Ahmed Yassin and his friends who were not happy with the Muslim Brotherhood thinking about resistance in Palestine, and they wanted to take sort of a more an action against Israel way before 87. So they were talking, that's what I'm trying to say. There were discussions before 87 among, within Muslim Brotherhood about where to go. But that's not my question. My question is, I felt like you're trying to imply that what happened in 2007 within the Palestinian national movement was basically a difference in the political project between Hamas and Fatah. That they both have, to start with, have a different political project that led to the division between the West Bank and Gaza. Because you rushed quickly into that, and I, if you can say more about this, because it's not a mere ideological kind of, difference. And my question to Lena, I really enjoyed your presentation. So basically there's the subaltern literature that, you're trying to situate your argument within. That's what I understood from your argument. But we also have the social movement literature that looks at this kind of conflict between elites as a process, as a long process, and not a dichotomy kind of process where that we have the bad guys and the good guys. And I was just wondering, where does your research stand in terms of, within such literature of mobilization and social movements?
Thanks. Any other questions? تفضل نظمي عارف عن حالك معلش.
نظمي جعبة from Big University. Sorry, I didn't attend your lecture. I came a little bit late.
He just flew in this morning, so he's jet lagged from Italy.
But still, I want to ask, and I want to join the assumption that really pre-Islamic Arabia is still a subject of study, and I think we have to wait for a lot of surprises. With the hope that in the coming few years that the land will open itself for scholars, not only for tourists, in order to study the inscriptions, which are really thousands of them. I saw myself thousands of inscriptions in different areas of the Saudi Arabia that waiting for scholars. But anyway, how can we classify the Hanafites within this framework of pre-Islamic Arab monotheism? Is it the one which mentioned in the Quran? And I suppose it was a very tangible movement in Mecca before Islam. Is it part of what you are describing?
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay,
The questions.
Did you hear the question?
Not very well, but we'll come back to it.
He's asking you about to discuss more the Hanafiya, to discuss who the Hanafis are and so on. Okay, I think now we'll stop the questions. Thank you very much. Fred, answer all the questions to you. Nina, answer the questions to you, and Jean-Pierre to you. So,
do I remember all the questions? No.
I don't know. You have his notepad there.
You mentioned Higgerism by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, which was a path-breaking book published in 1977. I think Albert Irani, in a conversation I had with him, summarized Higgerism best. He said they weren't getting the right answers, but they were asking the right questions. I mean, that was the book that really broke the mold for those of us who did early Islamic history and forced us to sort of give up relying entirely on the later narrative and literary sources, and said, they're presenting us with a kind of prepackaged vision of how Islam began, which comes from the later Muslim community itself. It's how later Muslims wanted to understand Islam. But how it actually began is not what we're getting from those sources. And we need to look at other sources. So they tried to do that. As Albert said, they weren't getting the right answers. The formulation they came up with was kind of wacko. But they were asking the right questions and sort of challenging all historians to say, look at the real sources, the documentary evidence for this period. So that book was, in spite of the fact that the reconstruction it came up with was like totally off the wall. Nonetheless, they were forcing us to do similar kind of work, looking at the documents, and I think we've come up with better formulations. So yes, in a way, my view of things follows on what they were trying to do, but I just think, one of the things they argued that there was this movement that was called Higgerism because they get that from Syriac sources usually, but the Muslims or the early followers of the Prophet Muhammad did not call themselves Hagarians or anything like it. They called themselves believers, mu'minun, which is sort of the point of my argumentation, that this is what the community began as, a community of believers, and Christians and Jews could be believers. It says so in the Quran. Some, anyway, could be believers. So it's not building on the findings of Haggarism, but it's building on the sort of methodological implications of Haggarism. And I guess the Hanafiya, well, we'd love to know more about it. It's interesting. Western scholarship has basically never talked much about the Hanafiya, even though it's in the Surah and it's in the Quran. But, we didn't have any other actual documentary evidence for it. But now maybe we're going to find it. We'll see. As I said, the thousands of new inscriptions that are being found, and because of GPS and lots of enthusiastic amateurs in Saudi Arabia who on the weekends jump in their Land Rovers and drive out in the countryside and see inscriptions and take pictures, and then they post them on the internet. So there's all this stuff which is suddenly available and you know exactly where it is because of the GPS coordinates. It's opened up a sort of, you know, whole new world in the exploration of both Islamic North and South Arabia. So we will see. I mean, we'll hope that we get more on the Hanafi.
Thank you.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Tafadhali, please.
Thank you, Raya. To be honest, I'm not actually placing myself in subaltern studies or in any other framework because I'm very much eclectic and historian. And in that sense, for me, I do learn a lot from different kinds of literature, but I also try to let my historical characters actually tell the story, and this is really what I try to do with this. And the story, I think, one of my issues with a lot of the theories is that they tend to be bilateral. And history itself is never that. The story that I tried to tell, and that's the reason I actually chose 3 sites for exploration, which kind of bring the state, the people of the city, the different classes or strata, and they're definitely also changing their definition as they go, is because the story is very complex. It's not just this, you know, tension between communists and the local elite, but it is between them and the state, and it is between them and the relationship that they try to construct with the residents of the city, which I think is something that we need more in understanding Palestinian history. So I actually do try to keep it a little bit more of a messy story than it could be within that narrative. I don't know if that's enough, but that's what I try to do.
Thank you, Lena. Jean-Pierre.
Yes, very quickly. So call this democracy whatever. What is sure is that it's a winner democracy. And I could make a parallel between this and the American democracy. You can call it whatever. What is sure is that the US have imposed their electoral calendar to the rest of the world. So that means that they are running the agenda. And running the agenda is already winning, because any diplomat, I've been a diplomat for 20 years, knows that if you bring the other party on your terrain, electoral terrain, ideological terrain, symbolic terrain, you've already won half of the way. So the Israeli system, and you can call it whatever, is by itself winning by always dragging on its own domestic priorities. Therefore, forcing the Palestinian party to minimize its own domestic priorities. I hope I'm So what I say about Zionism, Christian before being Jewish, I imply nothing. I just try to state facts and try to understand, you know, when you visit, and I'm sure you did often, Jabotinsky Museum in Tel Aviv, when you enter, you have this big sign, let's liquidate the diaspora before it liquidates us. So that's about, you know, how ironic is this world. When it comes to the Christian Zionists, they don't have that problem. Christian Zionists will support them 100%. They won't argue, they won't have Jewish agencies, they won't have this trend, that trend. They will say, we support you fully. And we saw the result of that in the recent years, and the abolition of some of the very pillars of the peace process. When it comes to ideological, well, in my Gaza history after many years, I just recorded that all Fatah founders, well, the majority of Fatah founders are former Muslim brothers. They decided to turn against the Muslim Brotherhood because they considered that Palestine was more important than Islam. The jihad call in 57. This tension is permanent, and what I don't know who was the second member of the Muslim Brotherhood leadership supported Sheikh Yassin in turning the Mujamma into Hamas, but there was only one. So maybe they were talking before, but at the moment of decision, are we going to lose the comfort zone of being a Muslim Brotherhood more or less protected by the Israeli authorities and so on and so forth, and move into being Islamic resistance. There was only one. Of course, all the Hamas members I interviewed told me I was the one, but there was only one who stood with the assistance because it's a Muslim brother, so it's not a democratic institution. So Sharia said, now we're Hamas, and it became Hamas. And that's this moment, the only thing I implied was that they occupied in few days the political space that PLO and Fatah as Harakat Tahrir al-Palestinian were occupying before. That's just thing I didn't imply more. But if you're talking about 2007, and it certainly was far more factional than ideological, and I'm happy to say that here in Jerusalem, if President Abbas on that day would have decided to go to Gaza and say, you are my people, I won't leave you to Hamas, because the majority of you at the end of the day voted for me. The history would have been very different. So I don't think all this has any kind of fatality. But of course, the moment you let this kind of dynamics develop without counteractions, then of course they produce the worst.
Well, if there were no geographical division to start with, there is nothing that,
Okay, but
this will not happen to start with, right? Yeah.
External constraints, internal dynamic. Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Fred. The session is about to conclude. I want to remind you that we have a break until 2:15. At 2 p.m. At 2 p.m. We're going to be showing a short film, 3 Families, 3 Libraries, about the cooperation between Dar Is'af al-Nashashibi, the Maktab al-Budayriyya and Maktab al-Khalidi, the 3 libraries. The film is about those things. That will be at 2 p.m. here, outside.
No, here. So
here?
please reconvene, but you're all invited to lunch.
In the meantime, where's lunch?
Right down at the bottom of the steps outside, in the Burak restaurant.
Burak.
The entrance to the.
Are we going anywhere from there?
No, you go back up here.
إسراء ومعراج يعني. Thank you very much.
Come back. Come back.
Close it down.
Excuse me, just try and get back here before 2, and please visit the manuscript lab upstairs. Anytime. You can go now to lunch, or you can go later.
I
Been here a few days.